Welcome, age of vintage society. Greer Garson was a major movie star for MGM during the Second World War. She portrayed a strong woman on the home front and was the fourth most nominated woman for the Best Actress Oscar, 7 Academy Award nominations, and finally the coveted Oscar for her role in the 1942 film Mrs. Miniver. Why was it forbidden for Greer Garson to speak too much? As you all know how much I appreciate you, my viewers, I want to thank you for your generous comments and for the Patreons. This video would not have been possible without you, and thanks to those who watched the video right to the end. Subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. Greer Garson was perfectly suited to the 1930s and 40s, as she was calm and dignified, a perfect English rose in a period racked with uncertainty and chaos. With a beautiful speaking voice and a surprising smile, her nickname, the Duchess, suited her perfectly. It's clear that with 7 Academy Award nominations under her slim belt, Louis B. Mayer knew the depth of her talent as well as her beauty when he contracted Greer to MGM at the age of 33. Born Eileen Evelyn Greer Garson on September 29, 1904, Greer was an only child to parents Nancy Greer and John Garson, a clerk in an import business. John was of Scottish ancestry, although he was born in London, and her mother was of Irish stock from the township of Drumalaw in County Cavan, Ireland. They lived in Manor Park, East Ham, which is known as Essex, but at the age of 2 Greer's father died during an appendectomy, and her mother then provided for the two of them by managing the properties left to her by her husband. Greer's childhood was plagued by chest infections and bronchial complaints, and she spent a lot of time reading in bed while recuperating. Greer was schooled locally and then attended King's College in London, where she studied French and 18th century literature, which fitted well with a childhood with plenty of reading in it. She then did her postgraduate studies at the University of Grenoble. She had no acting ambition at this stage of her life and thought she might become a teacher, but took up a position as head of the Lintas Research Library in the marketing department of Lever Brothers. George Sanders, known for his role in All About Eve, for which he won an Oscar, worked there too. In his autobiography he says he suggested to Greer that she look into acting, advice she obviously took on board. When she was 27 years old she took to the stage and started performing at the Birmingham Repertory Theatre, where several years of training and seasoning followed. In 1932 she met and married Edward Snelson in 1933. Edward was a British civil servant who later became Sir Edward and then a noted judge and expert on Indian affairs. They honeymooned in Germany, and when he needed to return to his post in the village of Nagpur to continue his work, Greer chose to return to her mother and the theatre and live in London. The long-distance relationship didn't seem to work, and Edward watched all her movies that played in Nagpur and grieved. The couple remained apart for a decade of their marriage, and it was finally formally dissolved in 1943. 5 years after her marriage, she appeared in a half-hour production of Twelfth Night, which was one of the first instances of Shakespeare plays being broadcast on TV. By 1936 she was acting in Page from a Diary and Mademoiselle, both plays showing in the West End with well-known directors. In late 1937 Louis B. Mayer saw her when he was looking for fresh talent with the impending retirement of Greta Garbo and Norma Shearer, and signed the 33-year-old up to a contract with MGM. She spent 18 months waiting for a role that she thought would make the most of her talents. She didn't want bit parts, as she felt that she had been signed up as a leading lady. Greer wanted to make an impact with her first role. Around this time she hurt her back in a horse-riding accident on her first outing as a leading lady in the movie Dramatic. The part went to Louise Rainier, and Greer almost lost the contract before she filmed a single movie for MGM. Her first film role was Mr. Chips in 1938, where her portrayal of the character Catherine Ellis was nominated for an Oscar. What a way to start your film career, with an Oscar nomination for your very first role. This really launched her career in Hollywood. Pride and Prejudice was her next film, and she received positive critical acclaim for her role as Elizabeth Bennet, which might have taken a bit of the sting out of knowing that her co-star, Laurence Olivier, wanted his lover, Vivien Leigh, to play the part. With both Lawrence and Vivian being married to other people and the affair a wide-open secret, producers feared the backlash and refused to cast Vivian Leigh in the role of Elizabeth Bennet. As it turned out, Greer was perfect for the role. Vivian Leigh's film Gone with the Wind was being filmed at the same time, and used up all the Technicolor film, forcing Pride and Prejudice to be shot in black and white. Despite this setback, Pride and Prejudice managed to get an Academy Award for Best Art Direction, black and white. Greer's performance of Elizabeth Bennet was singled out by the National Board of Review for special praise, however. Her next film, When Ladies Meet, a remake of the pre-code film of the same name, wasn't as successful. She starred alongside Joan Crawford, and the film was poorly received by the critics. Things looked a lot brighter the following year when she starred in her first Technicolor movie that showed her flaming red Irish hair to the public for the first time. The movie was the biographical and very heart-rending Blossoms in the Dust. She was nominated for the first of 5 Oscar nominations for her role as Edna Gladney, a woman who found homes for orphaned and abandoned children and campaigned to have the word illegitimate removed from birth certificates. Continuing her run of Oscar nominations, she starred in Mrs. Miniver and Random Harvest in 1942, where Greer was nominated for Best Actress for Mrs. Miniver and won the Oscar for her portrayal of a British housewife during the war. Mrs. Miniver was an instant success and broke box office records all over America. Both President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill recommended the public see the movie as a morale booster, helping boost ticket sales on both sides of the Atlantic. It was in the cast of Mrs. Miniver when she met her second husband, Richard Ney, and the probable reason that her first marriage was finally finalised. Richard was 23 and played her son in the movie, and with a 12-year age gap in their ages, they found their relationship to be under a lot of scrutinies. MGM's publicity team maintained there was a 3-year age gap and that they were happily married, but in reality it was a troubled marriage. After a number of attempts to reconcile, they divorced in 1947 after only 4 years of marriage. Her acceptance speech for her Oscar win has been recorded by the Guinness Book of Records as the longest ever made. It ran for 5 minutes and 30 seconds. The following year, the Academy instituted a time limit for acceptance speeches for the first time. Random Harvest was nominated for 7 Academy Awards and is listed as number 36 of the top 100 greatest love stories of all times by the American Film Institute. Greer followed these nominations with more Academy-nominated performances: Madame Curie in 1943, Mrs. Parrington in 1944, and The Valley of Decision in 1945, making 5 consecutive Academy nominations in a row. This achievement matched Bette Davis's achievement of 5 in a row nominations, a record that still stands for both women. Walter Pidgeon and Greer starred in 8 films together after he made the transition to the more dramatic roles from the musicals he had starred in the past. He was nominated for his role opposite Greer in the movie Mrs. Miniver. Their partnership ran across the decade of the 40s before he returned to Broadway and the stage. With the war over and many male film stars returning from the ranks, Greer was partnered by Clark Gable in the film Adventure, a movie about a sailor that falls in love with a librarian. The movie was advertised with the tagline, "Gable's back and Garson's got him." Clark had suggested he put the arson in Garson, and Greer is famously said to reply, or maybe I, put the table in the Gable. The film company obviously went with the safest slogan. Greer hurt her back while filming Desire Me in 1946. She was swept off a rock along with co-star Richard Hart by a rouge wave, and they were both rescued by a local fisherman and a film extra. There were fears she was about to be swept out to sea by the strong rip. Once back on dry land, Greer was battered and bruised and ordered to rest for a few days by the doctors. Her back would require further surgeries in years to come. In 1949 she met and married millionaire, Texas oilman, lawyer and pedigree horse breeder Buddy Fogelson. It was a good marriage and lasted until his death in 1987. They never had any children, and their pride and joy was their 5,556-acre ranch called Forked Lightning. By this time Greer was tired of dramatic roles and was keen to try some comedy. MGM wasn't keen and continued to cast her in serious dramas. She was envious of the roles that the newest redhead on the block, Lucille Ball, was getting. The irony that Lucille was desperate to be seen as a serious actress and work with more dramatic scripts is not lost on us. Although her popularity declined a bit in the late 1940s, she continued to make films well into the 50s. Her MGM contract expired in 1954 as she turned 50. She then turned her considerable talents to Broadway, performing in Auntie Mame, and received a very warm reception for her role. She only made a few films after her contract expired, but her role as Eleanor Roosevelt in Sunrise at Campobello gained her 7th and last Oscar nomination. She lost to Elizabeth Taylor, who starred in Butterfield 8. Greer began appearing on the small screen towards the end of her MGM contract, and in 1953 she was seen on What's My Line and Toast of the Town on TV. Her beloved mother, Nina Garson, died in 1958, devastating Greer, as her mother had been her main source of support throughout her career, and they had always lived together. Her mother's death was a great loss to her. In 1960, the Hollywood Walk of Fame honoured her with a star located at 1651 Vine Street. In 1966, she returned to MGM for one last movie, The Flying Nun, alongside Debbie Reynolds, and then appeared in a Disney movie as Cordelie, the millionaire's wife, in the live-action version of The Happiest Millionaire. It was to be her last film role. In 1967, Greer retired with her husband Buddy to their Fort Lightning Ranch in New Mexico, and after purchasing a Hall of Fame champion horse called Ack Ack, they became successful horse breeders. She claimed her horse skills were minimal, to say the least. She also maintained a home in Dallas, where she funded the 366-seat classical thrust-style Greer Garson Theatre at the Southern Methodist University and the Santa Fe University of Art and Design to the tune of $7 million. Her funding conditions were that the stages be circular, the premiere play is A Midsummer Night's Dream, and that the ladies' facilities be extensive. These theatres are well loved by the universities for their variety of entrances, ramps, trapdoors and seating configurations. It resembles the Globe Theatre in London and is the only one in the southwest that incorporates elements like the modified horseshoe-shaped design. In the late 1980s, a fire in her Los Angeles home destroyed many possessions, including her Oscar trophy. The Academy graciously replaced it for her. Having dual citizenship, Greer was honoured by Queen Elizabeth II with a CBE in 1993 for her achievements in drama and entertainment. She was a huge philanthropist once her movie career was over, and donated many millions to various educational and cultural institutions and charities in Santa Fe. She was fond of Easter seals, Christmas seals, the Heart Fund, and the Cancer Crusades of California. During their retirement years, Greer and her husband became campaigners for the environment, donating over 300 acres of land that became part of the Pecos National Monument. She also founded the E. E. Fogelson Library in memory of her husband and received an honorary doctorate from Southern Methodist University, which she cherished more than her Oscar. One of her last works was to voice the story of the Little Drummer Boy, and her stunning voice can be heard every Christmas when the movie is played on television. Greer outlived her husband Buddy by a decade. While his health declined during the 1980s, she was reminded that the Santa Fe altitude wasn't helping her own heart condition. They moved to their Dallas home, but in 1987 Buddy lost his health battle and died just before Christmas. Her final few years were spent in the penthouse suite of the Dallas Presbyterian Hospital, where she could enjoy visits from family and friends but remained under constant medical attention for her fragile heart condition. Greer Garson died peacefully of heart failure on April 7, 1996. Up until her death she was weak but lucid and very bright, said John Roach, a family friend, and her attorney. She was 92 when she died. After a memorial ceremony, Greer was buried next to her husband in the Sparkman Hillcrest Cemetery in Dallas. Her papers and personal effects were donated to Southern Methodist University, Jake and Nancy Harmon Library in Dallas. The beautiful and gracious Greer Garson was a friendly, warm person on and off the screen. She was a Titan-haired goddess who became one of the screen's leading ladies and literally never gave a bad performance. You would not believe how restricted were the lives of the vintage actresses. How Claire Moore's publicity stunts destroyed her career. Watch this video.